Hello, and welcome to this Australian BioCommons webinar. My name is Georgia. I'm the Australian BioCommons BioCloud Training and Communication Officer, and I will be your host for today. This webinar is part of a series in which we share useful information about the latest digital techniques, data, and tools that are available for the life science community. You will hear from local and international experts who present a bioinformatics topic that will support Australians to deliver their best environmental, agricultural, and medical research. You can keep up to date with the latest Australian BioCommons news and events via the channel listed on the screen. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. In my case, this is the Gadigal people. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognize their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Benjamin Goudey to speak to us about how AI is transforming life sciences. Ben is AI technical lead at Australian BioCommons, where he examines how AI is used or could be used in Australia's life science community to improve research impact, and how Australian BioCommons can help remove barriers towards this goal. Ben completed his PhD at the University of Melbourne, focusing on novel methods for analyzing large genomic datasets. From 2013 to 2021, he was a research scientist at IBM Research, then rejoined the University of Melbourne in 2021 as a research fellow in computing and information systems, and later at the Florey Center for Neuroscience. With 42 publications and 6 patents, Ben brings a wealth of experience in applying AI across a range of life sciences domains. Welcome to the webinar, Ben, and I'll now hand it over to you to start the presentation.
Thank you, Georgia, and thank you everybody for joining today. Just very briefly before we get into it, I mean, who am I? Georgia's just given me a wonderful introduction. But I just want to say that I am, here as the AI tech lead at BioCommons, sort of taking my experiences from academia, from industrial research, and I'm now looking to support sort of the broader life sciences community in Australia with their use of AI. And part of that is education, and that's sort of why I'm here today. So AI, I mean, it sort of comes up a lot these days. There's a lot of hype around this in the life science. You look at the news, you see all sorts of things, AI tools in predicting cancer, responses to therapy, finding subtypes of diabetes, I don't know, predicting treatment response from images, right? It's sort of everywhere. What's not clear is actually when people are talking about this, what is it they mean, right? What is AI actually referring to in these particular sorts of instances? So that's really what we're going to talk about a lot today. We're going to unpack this definition quite a bit. I'll talk about different definitions of AI, why it's useful, why we might want to understand them, how different types of AI that we work through are sort of being used in the life sciences, and in particular, how they relate to each other so that you can get like a clear picture of how all these different technologies, how they align, how they build on each other. And we'll talk about key considerations if you want to start using some of these technologies in your own research, or maybe you're using them already. What can we think about here? There's lots of things we're not going to cover. We don't have heaps of time today, and it's a pretty broad topic. So we're not going to be talking about algorithms, coding, implementation. We'll touch on infrastructure, but not in any real sense, just as a way of describing some of these methodologies. And we're not going to be going through really any worked examples of this stuff. So that's all much too complicated today. Today is very high level. So why should I care, right? Me, a researcher. It matters, right? The language that we use, we all have to be on the same page of it. And something like AI, the problem with it is it is sort of viewed and described often as a magical box that can solve many of our problems. So I think understanding actually what we mean can help get everyone on the same page when sort of working through AI related ideas. Obviously, it can help when you're going through articles, the literature, lots of claims are being made about AI, and understanding some of the underlying concepts, technologies, what it's built on can help you evaluate pretty easily, are these claims likely to be accurate? Um, it can help you to tailor language. So one of my colleagues the other day had a really interesting experience where, she was like, hey, I'm doing something quite simple. But when I talked to my ethics committee about this, actually they view this as a very different type of application that I'm doing with different kinds of privacy implications or ethical implications. So being able to use the right language can really help to either impress or perhaps not frighten review committees for grants or ethics. And finally, just being aware of what these different techniques are can help you in your own research, can help you understand, hey, if I want to do this sort of work, what do I need? What is my data requirements, compute requirements? What does it look like to get started with these things? So a very high level definition of AI, right? We're talking here about technology that allows the computer to do something that would normally require human intelligence. Or maybe it's, letting a system act in a way that demonstrates intelligence. But this is sort of too broad actually to be very helpful, right? When we're looking at this under this definition, I might be talking about fitting like a simple linear regression model. Here's a plot of like the number of hours of sleep that I get versus how grumpy I am. The more sleep, the less grumpy, which is roughly true. But it could also be, human-like intelligence, right? We might be talking about some cybernetic organism that could act in a very human way. Um, Although surprisingly, it doesn't understand human language as well as one might expect and what we see these days. So, I guess broadly, my opinionated take on this is that when people are talking about AI, they might mean one of these four sorts of things. They might be talking about a concept of artificial general intelligence, very intelligent machines that can demonstrate human capabilities. They might be talking about machine learning, which is, in some sense, a much simpler set of um, tasks that we're looking at, but still have their own complexities and utility. They might be talking about deep learning, or they might be talking about some of these recent developments in large language models and generative AI, right? ChatGPT and its ilk are absolutely everywhere. But it's not always obvious. So we're going to step through these. We're not going to step through the AGI one because it's not so relevant to the life sciences as I'm aware at the moment. All right, so AI as machine learning. So what are we talking about when we're talking about machine learning, right? This is really a class of algorithms that are designed to learn patterns in some set of data that you give it, typically with a view that these patterns will hold when given new data that haven't been seen when we're actually, you know, building these algorithms, these models from the data that we had at the start. So that is to say they are generalizable. They'll hold at large. So we can contrast this with what we do in traditional programming, where normally we would write a program that follows an explicit set of rules. So imagine I'm given a genome and I want to use this genome to predict risk of some condition, right? I might have an explicit set of rules that say something like, if I have mutation 1, this puts the individual at higher risk. If I have mutation 2, this puts the individual at lower risk, right? I'm encoding all of my knowledge in there directly, but it's not very flexible. It's not going to learn from some large data sets. I have to have all that information ahead of time. In machine learning, we're talking about learning how to do this from the data, right? So a broad sort of way of looking at this is to say, well, I'm going to guess, right? At the start, I'm just going to guess from my mutations who's at high risk, who's at low risk. And I'm going to use these guesses to allocate some level of risk to different individuals. And then I'm going to look at how my performance did at this first step and compare it to some known truth, perhaps, something that I already know. And I'm going to use that to refine my model, to refine how I've allocated risk from these mutations. And I'm going to repeat this over and over again. It's dependent on the data that I give it and the kind of strategy that I use. But broadly speaking, that's what we're talking about. So, okay, I've sort of alluded to this already with my linear regression earlier on, and you can start to say, well, doesn't this hold for statistics? Aren't, linear regression, logistic regression, aren't they doing this sort of thing? It's exactly true, right? And they certainly potentially are, right? So these are more conceptual differences between machine learning and sort of classical statistics. In machine learning, our goal is always prediction, right? We're often less concerned about what's happening in the model. We want to make sure that our ability to make predictions on data not seen by the model um, works, right? Is accurate under some in some sense. In statistics, our goal is often attribution. It's about understanding the relationships between variables of interest. So we'll often talk about things like effect sizes or differential expression or strength of associations. And typically we're going to look at one data set all at once. Nothing will be left aside. Um, but honestly, it's a bit of a blurred area, and I'm sure people can think about examples that sit between those two. There's a really great paper from 2001 called "Statistical Modeling: The Two Cultures." If you're interested in exploring this question, this is like a really easy read and very, very nice. So when we're thinking about machine learning broadly, this is a pretty big class of models. We often categorize them into different types depending on the problem they're looking to solve. So one example is supervised learning. So on the left here, you can see I've got these blue dots and red dots, and they're in a two-dimensional space, sort of saying that I've got two different measurements, two different features, if you will, in machine learning terminology, that I can look at this data and say, well, how can I build a model that splits these two classes up? The important thing here is that I know what the outcome is that I want to separate, right? I know what the red dots are. I've got examples of what the blue dots are. I want this to work in the future, but the data I've got today actually has that information. You can contrast this with another class, which is unsupervised learning, right? This is clustering sort of situations where I actually don't know ahead of time what my groups are. What I'm looking to do is learn, are there some, observations in my set of data that are more similar to each other, that have some sort of grouping? In both of these cases in machine learning, typically our goal is not just that it holds on the data I've got, but that it works in the future. So again, I'm hammering this point about generalization because it's important. And it's worth noting there's lots of other classes of problems. We're not actually going to talk about any of these today, but there's lots of things you can do. There's also lots of different types of algorithms, right? We've alluded to regression-based algorithms, and that's a whole class of things. There's also tree-based and non-parametric models that don't have a whole lot of assumptions, are learning a lot of rules from the data potentially. It's a big class of models. You've got ensemble models that are actually lots of little models that we combine together in some way. And we've got neural networks down the bottom, which we'll talk about in a little bit of detail here. Now, we're not going to go through any of these, but there's an important point to note, which is these have different characteristics, different assumptions, and different requirements in terms of sort of the data that's underpinning these, how much data you need, and how flexible these models are at the end. So there's a lot of information sort of in trying to understand what's useful for a particular task. Now, all right, neural networks are worth talking about. This is probably the scariest slide in the whole talk. So if you can get this, you'll be fine. What are neural networks? They end up being a sort of building block for many of the things that we talk about in modern AI techniques, if you like. So imagine that I've got three different measurements, right? They're here on the left-hand side, x1, x2, and xm, right? And for each of these, I'm feeding these and taking some weighted summation of these. My weights are W1, W2, and WM. And we'll often refer to these weights as parameters. All right, so I'm taking a weighted sum. Actually, if you look on the right-hand side, where we've got a sort of an equation version of this, where we've got this W0 plus some summation, this is like a linear combination of inputs. It's a regression model. Very similar to what we know already from our sort of undergrad days. The difference here in a neural network is that we then pass this weighted combination through some what's called a nonlinear function. I'm actually not going to talk about that at all today, except to say it introduces a little bit more flexibility into the model. So, okay, so neural networks, sort of like regression. We fit them differently. They can be a bit more flexible. What's cool? All right, so not the cool part, just the simplified part. I can take that diagram I've got, I can get rid of my weights, I can get rid of my other bits and pieces and just represent it as a simpler sort of picture. Still the same, pretty much like a regression model. What's the cool thing? So I had this, I'll go back to my simple version just for a moment. I've got this all passing into this weighted summation, pass it through a nonlinear thing, right? That's my Z here. I can actually have multiple of these, right? So in a neural network, we have these things called neurons. We're passing information from our input, which is here X1 and X2. We're passing that information into different neurons, and these form what's called a hidden layer between our inputs on the left and our output on the right. And you can see that I've got now a hidden layer of size 3. I've got multiple of these neurons. And additionally, I've now got a lot more arrows, right? These arrows are like parameters of the model. So this gives us a lot more flexibility, and it means that we can learn more complicated functions. All right, great. So you might say, Ben, this is excellent. I can fit really complicated, interesting shapes here. Why don't I just do that, right? Grow this hidden layer really large. What's the problem? Well, the problem is a very key challenge in machine learning, actually, that affects everything we talk about in this talk. We want to find a model that is sensitive, right? Can find subtle signals in the data, but is not going to get confused by noise or idiosyncrasies of my data. So this is a very famous sort of picture. On the left-hand side, in fact, in all of these plots, what I'm showing is the same observations in blue that have been taken from some underlying true function, right? That's what our orange line is. So that's like where the truth is. But we only observe the dots. On the left-hand side, I fit a really simple model. It's just a line, right? But the line doesn't, it's not matching this true function. It's not even aligning very well to my samples, but it's the best single line that I can fit. On the right-hand side, I'm at the other end. I'm fitting a super complicated, squiggly function, looks cool, goes through every dot, except maybe two. Great. All right, but if I get new data in that comes out of this true function, right, the orange line, it's not going to work. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. And the question is always, how do we get to that, right? So if our model is too complex, that's going to be a problem because we might end up in this overfitting part. It's always about avoiding that. So that's machine learning, as much as we're going to talk about it today. What are the requirements when we're thinking about data sizes, we're thinking about compute needs? So, in machine learning, oftentimes still, you could start with 100 samples and do something depending on the problem, right? Depending on how hard it is and what your measurements are that you've looked at. You might have 10,000 measurements. I mean, honestly, you could have 100,000, different observations that you've collected. It's a bit problem dependent. A lot of the time in the life sciences, these are things that you could fit on your local laptop. That claim is not always true. These are very approximate. Interestingly, the number of parameters in a resulting model will be somewhere between 10 and 10 million, right? So actually, we're going from very simple models to things that could be very complex, but still they're not necessarily that hard to fit computationally. An important point to note is that this is sort of talking about requirements for training a model, right? For actually building a model from scratch. Once a model has been made and all of those different parameters and choices have been set, actually making a prediction is much faster. And you can think of it like, when I'm fitting a model, I've actually got to, make predictions over and over and over again in order to understand, well, how do my predictions compare to some, thing that I'm trying to optimize? Whereas when I'm making predictions on unseen data, I just make them once. So how is machine learning used in the life sciences? Well, it's absolutely everywhere, right? And I've made this point of like it's common when dealing with small sample sizes, but I mean actually it's just common, really. It's just an effective. Oftentimes, some of these models are still useful when you've got smaller data sets. That's the point I'm trying to make. There's been, these are just a couple of headlines that I've been familiar with from my work. This is an example that came out in a very high impact clinical cardiology journal where they were looking to build a model that could predict for people that weren't at very high risk of cardiovascular disease, for people that weren't at very low risk, can we use lipidomics, right, data that we've measured from mass spec, to actually stratify the risk of these individuals? And they did this using a regression type model, right, but in a machine learning framework. There's actually blood tests that are starting to come out for Alzheimer's disease and are becoming commercially available. So these are tests that measure particular proteins in the blood and correlate these with levels of amyloid observed in the brain through PET imaging, amyloid being this hallmark protein of Alzheimer's disease. What's under the hood of these? Well, it's a couple of clever measurements, and then they use a linear regression model to combine them with age and just a little bit of genetic information. And if you've ever used GAT-K, there's a recalibration score in there. Actually, that's also a machine learning model trained on a few thousand samples. So this comes up everywhere. So to summarize this part, I mean, when we're talking about machine learning, we're talking about algorithms that learn patterns from data that will hold on unseen data. And our primary goal is prediction, particularly on data not seen. There's actually a whole lot of complications under the hood, but at least oftentimes, you can get started with this on your own computer, at least most of the time. So building on from that, we move into deep learning, right? And what is deep learning? Well, we talked a little bit about neural networks. Here's a slightly different view on them on the left. And we talked about this sort of simpler case on the left-hand side. Deep learning is neural networks where we have multiple hidden layers. That's at the core, the definition. And people argue a little bit about like, oh, but how many hidden layers are needed and how much complex, too hard. And I don't think it matters for today's talk, right? That's really the core concept. Now, what's interesting about these models? So, I've got two pictures down the bottom, one being machine learning and one referring to deep learning. Now, in the machine learning case, ahead of time, we have to say, well, what are the measurements, right? What are the features? That's the same thing in machine learning parlance, but we think are going to help us to make accurate predictions or get good clustering or whatever our task is. We have to define these and we put them into a model that can take that on. In deep learning, one of the clever things is that these multiple hidden layers ultimately act as ways of extracting robust representations of structured data, right? So images, text, audio, they end up learning, well, what are useful ways of representing this data for downstream prediction? So always you can sort of think of these as having a feature extraction stage or a data representation stage that feeds into some sort of classification or clustering sort of endpoint on the right hand side. A more tangible example of this is, images are great because you can see them, right? So that's why I'm using this as an example. Imagine that we were predicting something about faces, right? Maybe it's a motion recognition. When we're talking about deep learning, what might get extracted? So imagine my input data is these faces shown up on the right hand side. Well, in the earlier hidden layers of a model, we might have some edges or some dark patches that are pulled out. Very simple, very basic sorts of representations. Once we get to the middle, we start to extract actually things that you can look at and you say, that sort of looks like a nose. Oh, and that looks like an ear, an eye, right? We can start to see what these are. And eventually, if you've got lots of data in a very deep network, you might actually start to uncover high-level features that are representative of facial structures. This makes a lot of sense in images because we can see them, we can understand them. It's a little bit less clear what that means if you're dealing with things like, I don't know, protein sequences or, data where you can't visualize it in this type of way. But Ben, didn't you say neural networks have been around for a long time? I actually can't remember if I said this, but Certainly they have. The first neural networks have been around since the 60s. They had this huge amount of hype in the 80s. They were being used for a long time. And even all of these models that we're talking about are really designed in the 80s in deep learning. What changed? So data is the biggest one, right? The advance of the internet, people sharing large data sets, particularly driven by imaging and text, but then later on everywhere. People realized that when we have this problem of balancing model complexity and not overfitting the noise, right? The best way to get around this is to shove more examples into your model. Now, if you've got more data and you've got more complex models, actually you need compute to go with this. And graphics cards were critical for this, right? Graphics displays, three-dimensional things are highly reliant on matrix operations of images. And actually neural networks are also sort of heavily dependent on matrix operations. So you could actually take all of this compute, shove it onto some specialized hardware that could do this very quickly. And the combination of data, compute, led to really big advances in this sort of space. Now, all right, I've mentioned this idea of deep learning just being an extension of neural networks, but actually, I mean, there's a huge amount of complexity that I'm not referring to here. So, in particular, how do we configure these things, right? How many hidden layers do I need? I've got all these little arrows between things. What's connected? What's not connected? I've got this nonlinear function that can also be adjusted, right? So there's all sorts of things that need to be configured correctly to suit the data and to suit whatever your particular problem is. And, when we're talking about network architecture, it's really all of those things. So there's particular types of architectures for different types of problems. I sort of won't go through them today, but different architectures, work better with different kinds of problems. That's really the point. Another super cool thing about deep learning that actually really led to a lot of advances was this notion of fine tuning. So imagine that I have a model, and what I'm doing is I'm taking lots of images about pets, particularly cats and dogs, and I want to learn a way to predict, given a new picture, is it a cat? Is it a dog? And I've got lots of pictures of cats because like people love posting pictures of dogs and cats online. So, all right, I'm going to build this big model. It's going to learn useful representations of these images. Great, right? And I've got this little classification-y bit on the ends. But now imagine I'm in the life sciences space, right? Maybe I've got brain images. They might be MRI, they might be spatial omics, doesn't matter. People have realized that actually they can take a model trained on something like cats and dogs, use most of the layers that are really there to extract useful representations of the data, pop off the end part that's for predicting cats and dogs, and put on a new classifier at the end or a new model at the end, and only train these latter parts of the model. You're reusing all of this ability to extract useful features, but tuning it towards a particular task that you might have, right? Here I'm talking about brain segmentation, but it could be any other sort of thing. So cool, right? That means no longer do I have to have these huge data requirements. No longer do I need these huge compute requirements. I'm just fine tuning this bit. Works really well. Not so much in this sort of case. This is probably like, cats and dogs versus brains might be a bridge too far. But if you have tasks that are more similar, this can work really very well. Of course, it requires a lot of experimentation to figure out how many layers I should pop off and how do I set up this. So there's still complexity there. So deep learning requirements. Uh, we've now got much more complex models that have a lot more flexibility. And with that comes a much higher requirement in terms of the amount of data that I need to put into these to get out robust predictions. So I'm now going and talking about sort of 10,000 or 100 million examples that might need to be put in. Obviously, it's a sliding scale. Nobody knows exactly how much is required here, but there's always a view of, the more data, the more different observations you have that you can put in, images, genomes, whatever your task is, the more robust your model will be. The compute needs are also different. So now, I mentioned this before, they're really dependent on having access to these graphics cards, these GPUs. If you've got one, that's great. If you've got many, things are going to train a lot faster. And that's really important when you start to have very large models, very complex models with a lot of data going into them. With the number of parameters, this also grows quite a lot. We're now talking about hundreds of millions to, potentially billions of parameters that need to be fit here, depending on the complexity of the model. Um, all of this is very, very approximate, and I'm sure you can find exceptions to what I'm describing here, but this gives you an idea that there's really quite a shift from this broad category of machine learning to what's in deep learning. And where does this get used in the life sciences? Coming back to our topic today. So, really anything using imaging or spatial sorts of data. I've given an example here related to breast screening, just because this is a sort of area that I've been involved in the past. And I know that they're starting to roll out some of these models into sort of radiology centers. But almost any time you're dealing with image segmentation, registration, prediction, a lot of the time these days, deep learning is sort of the way to go. In multiomics, they're also being used quite a lot. So where I've got different types of data, and I might have to deal with these different types of data differently, right? So the nice thing about these neural network models is that you can actually build sort of separate little networks for your different types of data and then come up with different ways of combining these at the end. So they're very flexible in terms of what they can do. It also comes up in, single cell sequencing, like annotation of this. People often pair it with other types of data. It comes up in many different types of places. One constraint, though, is many of the types of data that deep learning is good at working with are structured, right? So I've got imaging data where one pixel is going to be quite correlated with everything else. I've got text data where I have a sequence and, words at one point, there's a relationship with words around them. Oftentimes, when we're dealing with maybe a mixture of just a small number of measurements. So maybe I've measured some patient data, I've got a handful of variants for them, and I have some, I don't know, a few proteins or even 100 proteins from mass spec. Deep learning is often not so good for those because we can't figure out how to build an architecture that can extract meaningful representations from these because there's just not enough structure between those disparate types of information. So to summarize this part, when we're talking about deep learning, we're talking about a specialized category of machine learning built on neural networks, really expanding out the capabilities of neural networks. They're really powerful for structured data where I can learn some, useful representations of these. If the data set and your compute allows you to do this. There's a lot of complexity here in terms of setup. There's also a lot of complexity in terms of interpretation. And that's one thing maybe we'll touch on a little bit at the end if we have time. But, with many more parameters and a lot more complexity in your models, actually getting under the hood of what's happening here can be quite challenging. AI is large language models. And oftentimes when we're talking about AI these days, this is really what we're referring to. So, what are large language models? They are huge, deep learning models, right? So we've built upon the previous ideas that we just presented in the last section, where we now want to understand patterns in sequence data in particular. And oftentimes they're designed to generate sequences as well, not just to make predictions of them. So I've got a little example picture here, right? Where, I've got the text, I went to the something, right? And then we have a large language model here whose goal really is to say, well, given this surrounding set of words, in this particular case, this is my context, how can I predict what is going to happen next? That's sort of the goal of the large language model. In some sense, people talk about this as autocomplete on steroids because that's what it is, right? Our large language model is just learning, given this surrounding information, predict what I think will happen in the next part. And I'm going to talk to this quite often as sequences of text, but of course, it's also audio, it's protein sequence, it's nucleic acid sequences. People have converted images into sorts of sequences, and all of these models can be applied to those as well. For anybody that's used ChatGPT or has used any of these newfangled tools that have come out, you'll see them and you go, well, hang on a sec, Ben, this is not autocomplete. These are producing huge paragraphs of text that appear to be very clever. What's going on here? Um, it turns out, remarkably, it's just data. It's just more and more data. And maybe one more clever trick that I'll talk about in a moment. But these models are taking as much possible data as they can get. And in the case of things that you're using that are commercially provided, these are documents, it's code, it's academic papers, it's threads on Reddit and forums and all sorts of things. It's taking all of this information and learning a sort of compressed representation of all of this knowledge. That's what our large language model is. At its heart, though, it's all this just statistical, modeling that we talked about before. So the abilities of these models, everyone, including the researchers that were working on them, there was really quite a big jump. And there's a clever trick here, which we glossed over a little bit. When I've got all of those documents, I don't have any, I don't have much information about them. I just have text for the most part. The breakthrough here was to focus on saying, well, for each word in a given document, and they're often referred to as tokens in these large language models. It's a more general sort of term, but for each word, which surrounding words are the most important for making a prediction about this one? It's this attention mechanism that we won't cover it all today, but it was critical because it meant that we don't need anything other than the sequences themselves. And that allows us to learn a really rich representation of the structure and sort of patterns in this language. And I say language here in quotes. Oh, no, I won't. I'll come back to language because it could mean a lot of things, right? So large language models, what are we talking about now? Sample size is huge, potentially, right? Millions to billions of inputs. I say that people are, of course, training these on smaller amounts of data, but you don't see as greater capabilities coming out of them. And then the utility of these large language models is maybe less clear, right? Correspondingly, the compute needs are huge, right? Now, there are people training these on a single graphics card at home, but most of the time, right, these very big models that, OpenAI and Google are providing, these are trained on data centers of GPUs, oftentimes for several months, super expensive, huge energy costs. And the number of parameters has grown to billions, could be trillions of parameters now. So these are very complicated models in terms of what is actually under the hood. But those complications lead to these sort of emergent abilities. In the life sciences, one of the key places that we observed large language models working is AlphaFold, right? This breakthrough in protein structure prediction. So what's the problem broadly? You've got protein sequences, right? Amino acids. Here we're treating the amino acids as words, and we're passing these into a large language type model, right? With a lot of cleverness and some interesting evolutionary constraints sort of built on top. But at its heart, they're using the same sort of models that were originally designed for English text. And we're looking to predict protein structure at the end. Now, on the left-hand side, what I'm showing is the results of a shared task where people would put in their protein structure methods, and there was some withheld protein sequences for which they had the true answers. What we can see is a whole lot of very similar results, right? Our score is on the y-axis, and this one that is 2.5 times better than all other competing solutions was AlphaFold. and it blew away the entire field in terms of what it could do and led to, in fact, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2024. So that sort of speaks to how substantial the predictive improvements were in this space. But still, it's worth talking through some of the limitations here, right? So a lot of the data mapping protein sequences to protein structure came from a database called the Protein Data Bank. So this is full of proteins, sequences, and their corresponding crystal structures. So great, right? I've now got a model that predicts proteins for which I have crystal structures. But what about models? What about proteins where I don't have crystal structures for them because they weren't amenable to that sort of interrogation? Well, actually, sometimes AlphaFold works really well on these. Sometimes it doesn't. And it's very difficult for the end user to immediately make sense of this because sometimes AlphaFold can be very confident and totally wrong. I've also seen examples given where, I've got a very long protein. And actually, one of the problems with these large language models is after a time, they get a bit confused, right? Once I've passed in something that is too long. And so they take some shortcuts. And with long proteins, AlphaFold has a tendency to fold these up a lot more than they should. Still useful to a biologist who understands these outputs because they can say, well, ignore all that stuff that hasn't worked. Let's focus on the stuff that's good. But it means that you can't just look at these and make sense of them. All right, so a couple of quick definitions before we start to wrap up. One term that comes up a lot is Gen AI, generative AI. We're really just talking about models that can not only make predictions, but can simulate new data. So, a lot of these large language models, but not all of them, can do this. They take in a sequence of text, they produce new text. I take in a sequence of proteins, I produce new proteins. Sometimes these new data are potentially identical to the data that the model has seen previously. Sometimes they're new and totally wrong, totally unrealistic. Sometimes you get new data that is very, very good. And that's dependent on the model and the problem. You might see a term foundation models. This is really just a catch-all for really, really big, often large language models trained on really large amounts of data. And they can often then be used and tweaked for lots of different downstream tasks. So lots of models are now doing that, and it ties into that fine tuning that I spoke about earlier. And in fact, I recall there was a Nature paper that came out at 2022, end of 2022. What did they do in this paper? All they did was collect all the data that these guys had access to, shoved it into a model that was really sort of off the shelf, but then, could say, hey, we have a foundation model now. It's very exciting. And actually, they did get quite good performance on downstream tasks, but methodologically, there really wasn't much there. It was just a collection of large data, existing models, and then they demonstrated the utility of that. So how does ChatGPT fit into all of this? So ChatGPT is really like a specialized version of these large language models, or potentially building on these models. And it's been refined in such a way so that given a prompt, right, this set of text from the user or set of inputs from the user, generate out coherent and relevant text, right? Something that looks real. It can often be very wrong, but it's surprisingly good a lot of the time. I have some examples where it hasn't worked or where it's been a bit silly, right? So I've asked it, what's the time now? And it said, well, I don't have access to that data. I can't tell you the time, which makes sense. Large language models are, trained on data they've seen in the past. But if I reframe my prompts, can you use Python to do this? Actually, it gives me the time very accurately, right? So its awareness of its own abilities don't work. I asked it how many times does the letter R occur in the word raspberry, which had a misspelling when I put it in. It says 3, but it's actually 4. And then it says 2 in the correct word, but it's actually 3. That's with one version of ChatGPT. If we run this again on another version, it works perfectly well. So it's a little bit stochastic, right? It varies depending on what you're looking at. But I'm sure you've all had your own experiences with this sort of thing. So concluding thoughts, I'm sort of rapidly running out of time, but what do we mean when we're talking about AI? Well, it's quite context dependent. And here I've made the claim that it's either machine learning, this quite broad class of algorithms designed to learn patterns in data that are generalizable. It could be deep learning, which is a very complex set of neural networks adapted for specific types of data, or it could be large language models, right? These very large deep learning models designed for sequences trained on mountains of text and GPUs. Could also, though, be referring to ChatGPT or any of these chatbots, could be anything in Gen AI. So it really depends on who you're talking to. There's a lot of very broad questions here. Are these large language models or other AI, are they intelligent? I mean, all right, we start to get to the definition of the word intelligent here. And there's actually some debate. I mean, they're not really in the traditional sense of things, right? I asked some sort of simple questions before, it got them wrong. They're statistical models. They can link things really well, and they have these nice emergent sort of properties that appear to be quite intelligent, but they don't have any real awareness of numbers or logic, and so they make very trivial mistakes sometimes. It's an active area of research as to whether or not this type of model can be extended to be even more intelligent. Nobody knows what the limitations are, but probably we're starting to run out of like data and compute in some sense, although again, active area of research. Who knows what the future brings? You might say, well, I'm a biologist and I don't care about predicting things using statistical models. I want to understand whatever's underlying these complex systems. Well, it's tricky, right? I mean, these models, as I've described, are typically built to optimize predictive tasks. That can get you towards what's happening underneath. But what we really want when we're talking about deep understanding is like some sort of causal relationships. And we're not really getting at that at all. We're really just trying to say, can we predict things? There's lots of models out there. You might ask, well, which of these models should I trust? I mean, this requires an understanding of the model, of the input data and the domain, and that's often quite tricky to try and figure out what can I trust, when can I trust it, when can I not trust it. Um, and finally, I mean, there's a lot of these AI-based tools that are emerging online. When you're thinking about using these, you've got these questions of trust. Do I trust the outputs of the model? But of course, you also have a lot of questions as to, well, do I have the rights, right, in an ethical sense, in a data governance sense, to actually send my data out to some of these online tools? And is it going to yield, results that are helpful for whatever my downstream task is? So I mean, there's many, many more questions. Um, but I just want to say, thank you all for listening. Um, you know, the different types of papers that I presented at the very start, right? We come back to this opening question. What actually is underpinning these? Well, two of them are machine learning. One of them is deep learning. There's no large language models or complexity at all. So actually understanding this a little bit, um, you know, can get at the heart. And I think it's really not obvious in this huge hype bubble that we're living in. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ben. That was a great presentation. So we have time for a couple of questions. I think we start from a question from Thomas. He's asking, Ben, from your perspective, given the very fast-paced development of AI models out in the world, as undergraduates specifically, what would be the best approach to both study them and then implement them in our daily work?
I mean, it depends, right? So one of the tricky things here, and that I really don't understand particularly well, is how much or at what level do you want to engage with these? So there's a real division that's starting to occur between people who are using some of these AI tools and people who want to build or refine some of these AI models, right? So model builders versus model users in some sense. you know, there's a whole lot of work out there now on how do we effectively prompt some of these large language models? What are the kinds of ways that we can understand our outputs from tools where we can't see the model? How do we evaluate these? That's a very particular type of skills, right? And how do I use all of these tools to improve my productivity, to improve my research outputs? I mean, the other class of actually building models really requires quite a deep understanding. You need quite detailed programming experience. You need to understand what's going under the hood of some of these models, which speaks to, some statistical modeling, some machine learning understanding. That's a very different class of users. So I would say that you want to have an awareness, certainly of some of these details, if you're going to be somebody just using these tools. But it's a rapidly growing space. And actually, like I certainly struggle to keep up with what's going on. My advice to undergraduate students in that context would be think about what it is that you want out. And I don't know, muddle along as best you can. I mean, I don't know. It's very difficult to give very concrete advice here, I think.
Would you say that the applications of AI in medical domain knowledge are nothing short of magical?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, in specific instances, right? So what I'm really wary of is trying to take the learnings of AlphaFold and generalize them a whole lot. So we can certainly say AlphaFold is incredible. It's a huge advance. It won a Nobel Prize in just a few short years after its development because people recognized the value that it was adding. Um, it appears that there's going to be a whole raft of related um, areas that are going to emerge from this, right? There's a whole lot of people very excited in synthetic biology, in drug design, where some of the problems that we observe in that protein sequence space can be adapted to, other kinds of sequences. But I don't think we can say, well, it's certainly going to work for DNA sequences, right? Because it worked for protein sequences. They're very different in terms of, the length of the data, the complexity of the interactions. I think we should also be wary about saying, well, this is going to transform all of medical research because I think while it's going to have certain applications that work marvelously, there will be certain applications where that's not true. The other thing to keep in mind is there's always this problem of do I trust the outputs? So even AlphaFold and all of its ilk, these really breakthrough things, they still get it wrong, confidently incorrect. And that's always going to require a bit of understanding. So I'm I'm quite positive about the space, and there's a lot of huge impacts to be made, but I'm also very skeptical of trying to take this too far.
How do you think AI will influence and change the life sciences industry? Specifically, how will it change and shape the market?
It's a really good question, and one that I cannot say. I mean, I guess the market itself is pretty broad. Certainly in the last few years, it would have pushed everybody in an so like everybody that I know that is working in industry is now like, all right, I've got to get AI into everything I'm doing, whether it makes sense or not. Again, the bigger picture answer is sort of similar to the previous question, which was about like, do you think the impact of AI in medical research is magical? Here we're talking about industry. I think there are certain kinds of industry where it's going to have transformative effects on what can be done. Um, does that hold everywhere? It's not entirely clear to me. There's also a question as to, all right, a lot of people recognize that we're in a bit of a AI hype bubble at the moment. What happens if and when that bubble bursts, right? What happens when all of a sudden people don't trust AI as much or there are problems with this? What does that do to industry and what does the longer term look like? I'm not very good at like long-term trends, so I won't try and say anything, but it's going to be quite a mixed bag.
As I mentioned earlier, this webinar is part of a series of bioinformatics training events organized by Australian BioCommons. There are going to be upcoming AI-related events at Australian BioCommons, and you can find out more about these and other events on our website. You can also watch recordings of previous events on our YouTube channel. And finally, we'd like to acknowledge our funding. The Australian BioCommons is enabled by Increased Bioplatforms Australia. Thanks so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed today's presentation and look forward to seeing you again soon. And until next time, goodbye for now.